In sociology, all blood relationships are known by a technical term called consanguinity. Similarly, all relationships through marriage are given the term affinity. For example, the relationships between mother and son or a daughter, sister and brother or sister, father and son or daughter are consanguinal, while relationships between father or mother-in-law and daughter or son-in-law are affinal. The kinship system refers to a set of persons recognized as relatives, either by virtue of a blood relationship, technically called consanguinity, or by virtue of a marriage relationship, that is through what is called affinity. Affinal kin are individuals who are related to you by marriage. Unlike blood relatives, affinal relations are based upon a legality or a contract. Although they are considered to be members of your family, the kinship tie can be broken if the marriage dissolves, rendering you no longer related to the individual in question. Step-parents and step-siblings. In the event of one of your biological parents marries, their spouse becomes your step-parent. For example, if your biological father gets married, his wife is then your stepmother. Likewise, any children of the new spouse become your step-siblings. Step-siblings have no blood in common, not to be confused with half-siblings who share one biological parent. Step-children. If you marry an individual who already has children, those children become your affinal kin. For example, if a man marries a woman with a young son, the son then becomes the stepfather to the child, and the child is then man's stepson. Although you do not share any blood, entering the marriage makes you related to your new spouse's children. In-laws. When you enter into a marriage, your spouse's family becomes your affinal kin. In this case, in-laws, your spouse's father becomes your father-in-law, and you become his daughter or son-in-law. In-law relationships are not restricted to the nuclear family alone, but include the entire family. For example, your spouse's uncle becomes your uncle-in-law and you become his niece or nephew-in-law. Nieces and nephews. Nieces and nephews refer to your siblings' children, and these are blood relatives. For example, if your brother has a daughter, that child is your niece. But children of your spouse's siblings are your nieces and nephews as well. These nieces and nephews are your affinal kin. Affinal kinship in India. In both North and South India, we find the application of one principle of descent, either matrilineal or patrilineal. Irrespective of a society being either patrilineal or matrilineal, the kinship systems in both regions emphasize the role of affinity in social relationships and networks. This means that relationships established through marriages are important in both the systems. The distinction between bride givers and bride takers is recognized in both North and South India. Undoubtedly, the degree of emphasis on affinity does highlight the essential difference between the two systems. Yet, Dumont has tried to discover the underlying similarities between the kinship systems in North and South India. According to him, the very recognition of the distinction between bride givers and bride takers across North and South India shows the basic similarity in the kinship system. In all societies, so also in simple societies, social recognition of mating among their members is arranged through the institution of marriage. Monogamy is the most popular type of marriage found in simple societies. Few tribal groups also practice polygyny, where a man has more than one wife at a given point in time. This institution is indicative of the fact that the Toda give emphasis to social rather than biological paternity. In-law relationships. Relationships with in-laws are a special category within kinship systems that has not been widely studied. Generally, kin relationships are defined by either blood ties or marriage ties. Blood relationships are bound together by genetic lines, but relationships based on marriage are bound together by law and a code of conduct that accompanies them. In-law relationships are unique in that they are defined through a third party by both a marriage and a blood relationship. Some anthropologists have argued that in-law relationships are important to societies, both past and present, because they represent an alliance between two groups of blood relations. In these cultures, in-law relationships are clearly defined and circumscribed by explicit institutional arrangements and prescribed and proscribed behaviors. In Western ideology, however, the husband-wife marital bond is the central family tie and supersedes claims of the extended family. Despite agreement about the rules of membership, the codes of conduct associated with in-law relationships remain nebulous. The actual interactions and sentiments assigned to these relationships are subject to individuals' definitions. The few patterns that do exist and have been observed are restricted to relationships between parents-in-law and children-in-law. Other in-law relationships, such as that between sisters or brothers-in-law, appear to be solely based on friendship or idiosyncratic relations. Very little research has been conducted on affective relationships between parents and children-in-law, but there is ample evidence in the popular culture of negative attitudes toward mothers-in-law. These negative attitudes have also been documented in psychological studies wherein children report a perception of greater interpersonal distance and more negative attitudes towards mothers-in-law than mothers. The problematic nature of the relationship is also underscored in studies of early years of marriage that focus on adjustment of in-laws and the influence of in-laws on the marital relationship. The bulk of research on in-law relationships has focused on assistance and support patterns. These patterns reflect the distinctive feature of in-law relations, which is that they are generally conducted through and in a sense for the sake of a third party. Children-in-law primarily receive support from parents-in-law as indirect beneficiaries of parental aid to married children. Hence, the primary patterns of contact and support between children-in-law and their parents-in-law reflect customary patterns of parent-child relationships. Studies demonstrate that over the life cycle, aid between parents and children tends to be unidirectional from parents to children, and that parental aid is most concentrated in the early years of children's marriages and decreases over a period of time. In-law relationships, financial aid. Although financial aid most often begins and is concentrated in early years of marriage, aid in the form of services reaches a peak during preschool years of grandchildren. Both gender and class differences have been observed in provision of parental aid. The wife's parents tend to be a source of greater aid in the Western cultures. In-law relationships are subject to voluntary definitions and individual interpretations. Studies of the early years of marriage have shown the problematic nature of these relationships. Elkhesser or Corbis terms of service, while sons' parents tend to provide financial aid. More frequent financial help is given to middle class than to working class children and children-in-law. Working class parents, when they live close by, give what they can in terms of services. The presence of grandchildren also appears to influence in-law relationships. The birth of the first child has been reported to transform the mother-in-law, daughter-in-law relationships into one involving significant support patterns. Daughters with preschool children needed and received more help from both mothers and mothers-in-law. Mothers-in-law were more likely to give things, whereas mothers were more likely to do things. Daughters-in-law tended to seek help and advice more frequently from their mothers than from their mothers-in-law, and were more likely to express ambivalence about help from their mothers-in-law. Just as there is little evidence of direct support from parents-in-law to their children-in-law, so research is consistent in demonstrating that children-in-law make a minimal direct contribution to the care of their elderly parents-in-law. The flow of support for in-laws from the child generation to the parent generation is indirect and reflects patterns of gender differences associated with parental care. Parents are more likely to turn to daughters and thereby sons-in-law for help than to sons and daughters-in-law. However, help to the elderly, which does not usually entail financial support, is more restricted to services and help with household tasks and personal. This type of support is primarily performed by daughters, not sons or sons-in-law. Although daughters are the preferred caregivers for elderly parents, geographic proximity also influences parental care. When daughters are not available or geographically close, parents turn to sons and daughters-in-law for help when there is illness. In these situations, daughters-in-law often provide more direct support or service than their husbands, reflecting women's role as kin keepers. In the hierarchy of sources of support for the elderly, daughters-in-law take precedence over sons. Moreover, children-in-law are more often functional in the kin network than are consanguine kin who are more distantly related, such as grandchildren or siblings. There is some evidence, however, that caring for mothers-in-law is perceived as more stressful and requiring more tasks than caring for a mother. Support for parents-in-law can also take place in the form of co-residence. Again, the stronger kinship tie of women appears to dictate a greater number of mothers living with daughters and sons-in-law than with sons and daughters-in-law. Social class also has been observed to be associated with different patterns of support. There is a greater flow of financial aid from middle-class children to parents and parents-in-law than is true for working-class families, but a greater flow of service and co-residence exists among the working class. In-law relationships, offspring and reduction in divorce. The requirement of a third party as a defining factor for an in-law relationship makes these relationships uniquely vulnerable to dissolution when the marriage of the third party is dissolved by divorce or death. Along with gender differences, the presence or absence of children from the dissolved marriage appears to influence the continuance of in-law relationships. Once a marriage has produced offspring, in-laws become affinal relatives who are defined not only by the order of law but also by the recognition of a biological link to the child. Hence, when the legal basis of the relationship is dissolved, there remains a relationship based on a common biological link. It is this tie, combined with the tendency in the Western culture for mothers rather than fathers to retain custody of the children after a divorce, that appears to influence in-law relationships after divorce. Overall, divorce decreases in-law contact and support to various degrees. The extent of these decreases differs by gender and the presence or absence of grandchildren. There is greater interaction and support given between divorced women and the former in-laws than is true for men. It has been suggested that this greater contact may be motivated by the desire of grandparents to maintain access to grandchildren. Maternal grandparents have less contact with ex-son-in-law than do paternal grandparents with ex-daughters-in-law, and the extent of contact between the paternal grandparents and ex-daughters-in-law tends to diminish over the period of time as grandchildren grow and their needs diminish. In-law relationships are perhaps the kin relationships most subject to voluntary definitions and individual interpretations. Most often, in-laws serve as a reservoir of supplemental resources to be tapped as social norms dictate and practicalities allow. It must be underscored, however, that research focused on in-law relationships has been limited, and the patterns reported here apply mainly to mainstream US culture. Although researchers have observed that reported variation by social class, they have virtually ignored other demographic factors such as ethnicity and regional residence. In-law relationships and divorce. Getting along with the in-laws is never easy, but it could be the secret to a long and happy marriage according to a new research. Husbands who enjoy a good relationship with their in-laws have a 20% higher chance of avoiding divorce, an American study has found. However, the opposite is true for women. Wives who get on well with their in-laws are 20% more likely to split up. According to researchers at the University of Michigan, women who enjoy the company of their in-laws may become too involved with their husband's family to the point where wives believe their in-laws are meddling. The study at the University of Michigan's Institute for Social Research examined 373 same-race couples over a period of 26 years beginning the year 1986. All the couples were aged between 25 and 37 and had been married for a year or less when the study began. Dr. Orbach has followed them throughout these years of marriage. How are marriage and kinship patterns changing? In the year 1980, in the documentary Dadi's Family, we are introduced to a specific family in the Haryana region of northern India. The film explores the concept of family and the roles that a woman plays in life. The roles are daughter, mother, mother-in-law, daughter-in-law, sister-in-law and sister. These roles are illustrated to us via various members of Dadi's family. What social and economic forces are putting pressure on the kinship system of Dadi's family? In Haryana, education of the children is the main cause of change. In Dadi's time, women were uneducated and illiterate, making the ability to even marry be seen as a blessing to them, regardless of the type of husband they married. The only way for them to survive in the society was to get married and work very hard in the new family. For their low status in society, illiterate women had to defer to her in-laws. They had to be subservient and submissive, not talking back to their husbands, sisters-in-law or mothers-in-law. However, these relationships have been changed due to an increase in education. As majority of the farming families in Haryana come from an inferior caste in society, this puts a pressure on the women to secure a husband and keep him for economic security. The system of kinship refers to a set of persons recognized as relatives, either by virtue of a blood relationship, technically called consanguinity, or by virtue of a marriage relationship, that is through what is called affinity. Everyone has very strong ideas too about what is the correct and proper behavior of different kin towards each other, such as deference, respect, familiarity, avoidance, kindliness, protectiveness, and so on, as the case may be. All such aspects of kinship relations tend to be taken for granted unless or until one is confronted with the kinship practices of other people. It is a fact that, however strange other people's kinship practices may at first appears to be, a closer look will usually show them to be functional. They are useful for the maintenance of the society as a whole, contributing to its continuity over time and containing the conflicts that might potentially disrupt it. Kin means relative, and the study of kinship is the study of biological relationship based on the fundamental fact that man is a mammal. This means that man produces through social relations, and the children have to be matured and nourished. Thus, there are two kinds of biological relationships. First, there is a relationship between man and woman, which is a relationship of marriage. And there is the relationship between parents and children, which is a blood relationship. Sociologists have given technical terms of relations by marriage and by blood relatives. And these are affinal relationships and descent relationships respectively. But kinship is not merely study of biological relationship, because it is quite possible for a man to adopt children which are not biological his own, and so kinship must be redefined as a study of social aspect of biological relationship.